So today I'm here to talk about the best fantasy books I read this year that were published before 2024. So my backlist titles, this is part of my end of the year series, which yes, I start early. And so that just means more videos for you. If you enjoy this kind of content, hope you stick around and subscribe. If all that sounds good, let's get started with number 10. So in the number 10 spot, we have The Wandering Inn by Pirate Abba, the series up to number 9, which is what I have read so far of the published books that are out. I understand the web series is well beyond that. This story follows multiple points of view, but particularly it starts out from the perspective of Erin, who is a young woman who finds herself waking up in the secondary world in an inn, and she decides to take it upon herself to become an innkeeper, to form a life here, to figure out where she is and what is going on, and to make the most of the situation that she finds herself in. As I mentioned, eventually other perspectives are introduced and you have this mystery of how they got there, but more specifically, it's really a story about these characters. It is one that is incredibly goofy. It has a lot of humor, playing around with the humans of this world, trying to explain to the other creatures all about the nuances of our society. So everything from our customs, fast food, religions, it goes into sexuality, it goes into all the topics in really hilarious ways. I will admit that the first book didn't entirely hold my attention. I understand that the author is now doing a rewrite of that first book because it is a common criticism. The later books are really where I got pulled into the story, and there were several books in this series that I just found myself binging. The series is incredibly long, a huge word count, and it's a series that can become very addictive. So I will admit there were sections of this series where I just wanted to read book after book. I wanted to know what was going to happen next. It was funny, it was bittersweet at times, it had some fun character moments. I do admit that I have paused my read of the series at number 9 just simply because I found myself fatigued through the last couple books that I was reading, and so at least for now I'm going to pause it, which is why it's not higher up on this list. I recognize compared to a lot of the other books I'm going to be talking about today, this one does have weaker prose. It is something that is more to read if you just love a good story, if you're someone who is more particular to a certain kind of style when it comes to writing and have really particular feelings when it comes to the structure of the story and want something that is well edited down, where every sentence, every plot point has a larger purpose. This is very much the kind of story that you just go along with for the ride. If you just want to get into a series, get into a secondary world, and live there for a long time, I think you'll enjoy this, but it just depends on what type of reader you are. And then at number 9, we have Malice by John Gwynne. This is the first book in an epic fantasy quartet. It's told over multiple points of view, and each of the characters are found to be very distinct and very likable, where you really understand their motivations. The story itself, or at least the portion I've read, is highly reliant on the trope of prophecy, which is very traditional, but I think done very well. And so you have certain individuals that are prophesized to fulfill certain roles, and you follow the characters through that. Now, this book would be further up on the list if I had continued on with the series, but if I'm honest, while I really enjoyed this one when I read it, I found myself not as compelled or motivated to continue on with the later books. So definitely, if you think that the books just get better with each entry, let me know down below. Bug me a little bit, because I can definitely pick them up in 2025, which is my hope. But at the time, just based off the first book, I liked it a lot. I thought it had a lot of potential, some really great starts to it with some distinct, interesting characters that I cared about. But I don't know why I haven't kept going with the series, so I really should change that. Then at number 8, we have Under Heaven by Guy Gavriel, and this is a piece of historical fantasy that is largely inspired by a particular dynasty of China. And so it is this beautiful book that has gorgeous prose. It was lovely to read. It would be higher up on this list if I was more attached to the characters, but do I really appreciate the author for what they are doing? I can absolutely see why this author is a favorite of so many. I also could have put Tagana on this list, but I felt this one was a little bit of a stronger pick, so I decided to focus on this one. But both the books that I read by this author, again, were well written, highly detailed, dense in a really satisfying way. And so I will absolutely pick up more by this author, hopefully eventually finding one that just hits that sweet spot for me. It's entirely a case where this just simply might be a subgenre that's not entirely to my taste. I don't tend to read a lot of historical fantasy, but if I did love this genre, I feel like this is the best of the best. So if you love this genre more than I do, I definitely recommend picking up Under Heaven or Tagana if you haven't yet. Then we have The Blade itself and its 2 sequels that make up the trilogy, all by Joe Abercrombie. And of course, this is a booktube darling, a piece of grimdark fantasy that is highly character focused. It's one where I actually read the first book several years ago and liked but did not love it, but I've always wanted to go back because of the fact that I tend to like darker fantasy stories, and I've heard that these characters are incredibly morally gray, and they absolutely were. I really did see the appeal better. I think that the series works better the more that you read, so I liked the second book more than the first, and then the third book more than the second, and it's simply because you become more familiar with the characters and want to spend more time with them. As everyone says online, again, the characters are not necessarily making the good choices, but you end up rooting for them anyway, which is what I think the author does best. This is a story that is definitely much more about the characters than a particular plot arc, and so if you're someone who reads for those elements and really loves, again, morally gray characters, if you haven't read this one, there's a reason that BookTube loves it so much. Then we have The Killing Moon by N.K. Jemisin and its sequel, both in the Dreamblood duology. This is a series that is loosely inspired by Egyptian mythology. It's set in a world where there are magic users that pull their magic from dreams. The premise is fantastic. I've said before that I don't think it's N.K. Jemisin's best work, but even her not best work in my mind is better, or at least more to my taste than other things that I read this year. I love that she has a great imagination creating these interesting, complex, and intricate worlds where she never just info dumps and explains everything that is going on, but rather lets you as a reader slowly piece together all of the things that are happening in the background. And sometimes you don't fully get the whole picture, which for some readers might be unsatisfying. For me, I enjoy the puzzle of it, and it just makes me want to reread her books more. So I personally really love her writing style. It's distinct. It's not for everyone, but it certainly is for me. So if you love this author's work and haven't read this Backlist title, know that it might not be the best place to start with them, but again, if you're already reading their work, definitely one that you want to check off the list. Next, we have The Range of Ghosts by Elizabeth Bear, which I feel like is one of the most underhyped books I read this year. I really enjoyed it when I read it, and then I feel like I never got the opportunity to talk about it again on my channel. This is a story that is loosely inspired by Mongolian culture, but in a fantasy setting. I am someone who is fascinated by the historical culture of the Mongols. I've read several nonfiction books on the topic and other fantasy books that are similar to this, but this, in my mind, is the gold standards for fictionalized versions of this world. It was beautiful and intricate, and again, great world building, great characters, compelling. The only reason I haven't continued on with this series is that my library does not own the sequels, so I might have to go track them down. It might actually be something I buy because I enjoyed the series a lot, and I simply stopped because it wasn't available for me for free, but I think it's a kind of series that is well worth the investment. So stay tuned when I get a chance to read the sequels. Again, really enjoyed this one, and it does work in my mind enough as a standalone that it was satisfying, that I was not disappointed. Even if I never get to read the sequels, I think it's still worth picking up on its own. Then at number 4, we have Red Sister by Mark Lawrence and its 2 sequels, which I all read this year. Again, this is another BookTube darling, so I think you're familiar with the fact that this series all involves assassin nuns. It has a very distinct main character of Nona that has a lot of personality. The beginning of this book, or at least the first book, starts out with a bang. Some really distinct scenes and a particular opening sentence that a lot of people, myself included, will praise as being something that is incredibly memorable. So this is one that I just plain enjoyed. I thought that it was fun, action-packed, it moved forward, it had likable characters. I don't think this is the most complex or out-of-the-box innovative story or series I've ever read, but I think that it does what it's trying to very well. Again, I think assassin fantasy is very popular right now, and I've seen a lot of it, good or bad or mediocre, and so seeing something that's well executed, that's satisfying, has a clear middle and end to it, and then a series that again has really memorable characters. I think the author is doing a lot of things right. Again, it's a reason that it's popular, and I'm glad I finally checked it out for myself. And at number 3, we have The Traitor's Blade by Sebastian de Castell. This is a series that follows a group of once greatcoats that were working and protecting the king. They fell into disgrace and now have to get together to complete one last job. This is one that perhaps is affected by recency bias, because it is, of the books that I talk about here, the one that I read most recently. And I really am surprised that it fell so high into this list, just because it is a lighter, more fun fantasy story where I typically will say that I'm drawn more to darker stories. But what I loved about it was the fact that, first, I think it's a great example of this, for lack of a better word, subgenre of fantasy that is really focused around brotherhood and male friendship. And so it reminds me a lot of the Liza Locke-Lamora, where you have these characters that are bonded together in their friendship. So you get to see them together and, of course, dealing with the aftermath of everything that came before the book started. I really enjoyed this one, and the biggest thing that surprised me is the fact that this book is very much focused around individual fighting. So you have all about the positioning of the weapon, the positioning of the field, feet and how they have to move around to best dance around during these fight scenes. And for someone who previously had no interest in anything involving fencing or sword fighting or any of the similar adjacent topics, I think that's a sign of a really good author when they can take someone like me and make them interested in those action scenes, where normally, I do admit, I read books more for the characters, the banter, the world building, and I typically list the action scenes as one of the things I care least about. But this book did it so well that I just found myself having a great time during those scenes, wanting them to be even longer. And I'm, if you can't tell, really excited to continue on with the series. I loved it so much. Definitely a new favorite and an unexpected one at that. I did not think I would love the series, or at least this book, that much. And I think I'm going to love the rest of the series as well. Then at number 2, we have The Darkness That Comes Before by R. Scott Bakker, as well as the 2 books that come afterwards in this trilogy of The Prince of Darkness. This is an apocalyptic fantasy story that is all set in a regressed society. It's heavily military focused. It deals with religious wars, and it has a huge cast of characters. It's really dense, it's really detailed, and it's a kind of book that is a lot of work to read, but the kind of work that you will relish in because it is so enjoyable to sink into. It's so rewarding when you find yourself putting together the pieces and understanding how it all fits together as best as you do. And it's not a book for beginners, but I think again that makes it even more satisfying for someone as you go through it. And it feels very earned as you get to some of the highlights of the story. And overall, it's a really solid trilogy. I enjoyed all 3 books. Highly recommend. If you haven't read it, I know that Mike from Mike's Fantasy Book Reviews recently also read it, and there's a reason the 2 of us are singing this series praises, because it's fantastic, and in my mind it's kind of been a sleeper online, at least in the YouTube corners that I live in, because I think a lot of you that love a lot of the popular BookTube book series are going to really enjoy this one too. It's underhyped, but I don't think it's going to be for long. And finally, at the number 1 spot, the book that nothing could beat in terms of backlist fantasy was 1Q84 by Haruki Murakami. And this is a piece of magical realism, which is not a subgenre I read a lot of when it comes to fantasy, but this is just so special. It is this epic story told over 3 parts where we follow different perspectives, but one being this woman who goes and finds herself in a version of her world that just doesn't feel quite right. Things have changed, something just feels wrong, and she's trying to puzzle out what happened. We also follow from the perspective of a writer who is helping to rewrite a young girl's book and get it published, and he's helping as the ghostwriter. And of course, things slowly come together. It's a book with some really interesting moments. You're trying to puzzle out everything along the way, and I'm a huge fan of this type of book that explores a world where it's almost like our world, but not quite. And for me, I thought that the explanation the author gave for what is going on was really satisfying, really smart, and I had just a great time reading this one. I thought it was just insightful and interesting with different character work. Now, I should give a disclaimer that this book does have some really troubling scenes in it. There are some moments involving underage characters, which I in no way condone. I do not want to give this book a pass, but I also recognize that despite having parts of this book that I should not be able to reconcile or ignore, everything else about this book really grabbed my attention to the fact that I can't dismiss the fact that I really love this book. I've read it more than once, and I think that there are so many great things going on, but I have to be very cautious when I recommend this to my audience that a lot of you may not feel comfortable to read some of this subject matter. A lot of you would be pretty off-putted by the fact that I like this book at all. And so I do have to say that this book comes with huge disclaimers. Check your content warnings, check what you're comfortable reading. But if you're open to reading a book that is fantastic but certainly has its flaws, this is one that I can't stop thinking about. I want to reread it over and over again, even though it's giant. It's just so powerful, so imaginative, so exciting. I thought the writing was beautiful, and I want to recommend it to everyone, but I really shouldn't. All right, that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I'd love to know, what is your favorite backlist fantasy book, so something published before 2024 that you read this year and loved? If I haven't read it yet, I will definitely check it out. Hopefully you stick around and subscribe, because I have more end of the year videos coming very soon. So stick around for that. If you want to help me out with this video, I appreciate a thumbs up, dropping a comment, even if just a little emoji to let me know you're here, like a dragon or a wizard. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.